People have more of an aversion to that. But there is still a gap between people seeing this as a problem and wanting something to do something about it. And the main argument of this new piece of work is that some of that gap is related to whether you think inequalities are structural or down to the individual, whether you're what your worldview is on those types of issues. So we did this segmentation analysis, which Britt used lots and lots of questions to split the population into these three groups. Structuralists, who are each are about a third of the population, 32% in the UK. They see characteristics, this structuralist group see characteristics outside the individual's control as important. Things like discrimination or whether you come from a wealthy family, those types of things. And that cuts across demographics. It is a more Labour group than other groups, but only around half of that group are Labour supporters. There are more graduates within that group, but again, it's not completely determined by your demographics. Then the second group, again, about a third of the population, 3 in 10 of the population are the individualists. They don't consider factors beyond the individual's control to be important. They kind of reject that idea. And again, it cuts across. They are more conservative, as you'd expect, and fewer graduates, but a range of different people within that group. And then there's a group who are in the middle. And they're in the middle in two senses, really, in terms of their opinions are in the middle, but they also don't have very strong views about inequality. Nothing is very fair or very unfair for this type of group. And they're closer to the individualists in profile, so they actually share more common characteristics with them. And you can see why this is important when you look at just a couple of examples of questions. So we asked people, on average, black people, we told people, on average, black people in Britain have lower earnings, more likely to be unemployed than white people. Do you think these differences are for a range of different reasons? I'll just show you a couple. First of all, because of discrimination. And you get about half of people saying that it's because of discrimination, but 3 in 10 saying that it's not to do with discrimination, definitely not to do with discrimination. And then we also get 13% of people saying it's because most black people don't have the motivation, willpower to pull themselves out of poverty. And this is based on a US question. It's not often asked in the UK. And that 13% seems very high in some way. You get 1 in 7 people thinking that's the case. But if you compare that with the US data, you can see similar on discrimination, similar levels of people think it's about discrimination, but 36% of people in the US think it's because black people lack willpower or motivation, and that's actually been going down recently. That's lower than it was in the past. So we're not as focused on that as you see in the US. But the key point about this is that vision, that how you see these things, very much depends on your worldview. So if you break that because of discrimination, people who think it's because of discrimination down by our three groups, you see massive differences between the three groups and how they see these things. So 2 and 3 structuralists think it's because of discrimination, but only 1/3 of individualists think it's because of discrimination. So your worldview very much determines how you see these different factors. One point to know about this is even among that structuralist group who see things holding people back as quite important, 1 in 5 of them don't think discrimination is important in worse outcomes for black people. And that reflects, I think, a bit that there is a general belief in the UK in the importance of individual effort and meritocracy. That we're out of all the countries, you look across lots of countries, we're one of the countries that has the most focus on that. And you can see that a bit when you ask people what do you think are the most important things for getting ahead in life, and this is the percentage you see, essential or important, a whole range of different factors. And you can see hard work and ambition right up the top there. For Conservative and Labour supporters, pretty equally. Hard work and ambition, having ambition are important to everyone. Then just under that, actually, education, hugely important to both, having a good education. And you can see how important that is to people across the board. But the difference really comes further down the list between Conservative and Labour supporters, where knowing the right people, coming from a wealthy family, having well-educated parents, having political connections, person's race, being a man or gender, a man or woman, much more important, more likely to be seen important to Labour supporters than Conservative supporters. So the point here is that it's not that Labour supporters just see structural factors. They see individual effort as important and individual ambition as important, but then they overlay it with these other factors that also can help or hinder people's progress. And that belief in merit is clear from the pandemic. When we ask people, how important do you think luck is in determining whether people have lost their job during the pandemic, people don't like the idea of luck being important. You've got relatively few people saying that it's very or fairly important that luck determined whether people lost their jobs. When actually performance at work was more likely picked out as an important factor by people in whether people lost their jobs. So, which seems quite a harsh view of job losses in an indiscriminate pandemic. But this is the starting point that people have, even among the structuralist group. So that's 40% of the structuralists actually think that performance at work was something that determined whether people lost their jobs during the pandemic. So we do have this quite strong sense of it's down to the individual. Final point, though, and a more hopeful one in the sense of discussions about inequality. It does seem that the pandemic has opened up some space for discussing the government's role in tackling inequality. We asked whether the coronavirus means there is more need for the government to take measures to reduce differences in income levels. And you get over half of people, 55% of people saying that's the case. So we have got that sense that the pandemic has changed people's views to some degree. And even among Conservatives, current Conservative supporters, 4 in 10 Conservative supporters, less so for individualists, that group of people who think it's all down to the individual, only 2 in 10 of them. But even there, you've got 2 in 10 of that quite individualistic group changing their minds about what's the role of government in this. And then the final point on what we see in quite a lot of this analysis of inequalities is quite divisive. It's quite embedded in people's values and underlying beliefs. But there is at least one unifying theme across it. When we ask people what's the most important types of inequality, which are most serious in Britain today, there's one consistent pattern across lots of different surveys that we've done on this, is it's the difference between more and less deprived areas comes out top and is a strangely unifying theme across different sorts of groups, Labour and Conservatives, structuralists, individualists. That does seem to bring people together much more than differences in income and wealth, and particularly between racial groups, different ethnic groups. And that is, we did an international survey as part of this, and that is something unusual in the UK. Out of all the countries in Europe that we surveyed, we're the most likely to put differences between areas top of our list. So it is a real focus, it's a genuine focus here, linking to the levelling up theme, clearly. So very finally, just some reflections. So I think what we learned from this, it's whether you worry about inequalities depends on how fair or unfair you see them. It's that sense of fairness that is key, which in turn depends on your views of the causes, if you view it as individual or something outside the individual's control. So it's deeply related to those deeply held world values and your worldview and your values. So it's relatively unshifting. It helps explain why we don't see big swings in lots of attitudes to inequality. Important to say that in the report that you've got on your chairs, there's more movement in some attitudes, and the belief that benefits are too low and cause hardship has been rising in a long wave over the last few years, and it's kind of crossing over so that people are much more likely to think that than in the recent past, and the change in universal credit is just going to keep that momentum going. So there is more sympathy and concern there. And a really important point from an academic called Peter Taylor Gooby is that when you talk about this individualist group, it's not that people are really delighted with how things are going and that it's all brilliant for them and they can just look after themselves. A lot of this is reluctant individualism, as he says. It's not delight with how things are going, but it's difficult to imagine, picture an alternative among many people. So we need to bear that in mind too. And then finally, there's some common ground on area-based inequalities, which we need to interpret that carefully. We did some focus groups, Ipsos Mori did some focus groups for IFS after this study, and it's very much not a simplistic north-south divide that people are thinking of. It's very local inequalities that people are thinking of, a kind of postcode lottery of life chances that people are worried about. And we need to not misdiagnose that. And very finally, it does leave an open door for discussion. And I think that's what the research shows overall, but only if you understand the very varied starting points that people are coming to this from. And I hope this research provides some of that evidence. Thank you. Anneliese.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed, Bobby. It's such a pleasure to be here and also to be with Paula and Sonia. I'm really sorry that I'm not going to hear what they've got to say, which is really frustrating to me. It's because I have to chair an event as part of Stronger Together, our policy roadmap, which is on jobs and work. And I want to come back to that in a moment because I think that's a very important part of this picture as well when it comes to inequality. It's fantastic to be at an event organised by UK and a Change in Europe and the King's Policy Institute, because I was there at King's when the whole public policy department was created in the very beginning out of the Department of Management. So really, really good to be with you and see how it's flourishing to such a great extent just now. Look, I think Bobby has gone through many of the core findings around the extent of inequality in our country and people's attitudes to it. So I don't want to go through all of that again. I suppose just to pick out a few other elements. First of all, around regional inequality. I mean, of course, the UK is one of the most regionally unequal countries within the OECD now. And of course, those imbalances have enormous social consequences that I'll come back to later. We know, for example, they have health consequences, which were brutally in evidence during the pandemic. And now really quite major differences around life expectancy in different parts of the country and indeed between different groups of people. We've also seen some of these developments taking place in Scotland, and I would just underline that this is not just an English issue about regional inequality. It very much is one in Scotland as well. We now see, for example, life expectancy in Scotland being the lowest in Western Europe in some areas, which is appalling. And of course, with the highest level of drug deaths, for example, in all of Western Europe per capita. But of course, this isn't just a regional picture. As I said, it's also about different groups of people, as Bobby was pointing at. He talked about unemployment. We know that ethnic minority people are twice as likely to be unemployed as white people. Black workers with degrees, interestingly, paid almost a quarter less than their white counterparts. Only around half of disabled people in work, despite most disabled people saying that they would really like to be in work if the right work could be found. And those who are earning 20% less than non-disabled workers. 1 in 5 LGBT plus workers having been the target of negative comments or bullying at work, rising to 1 in 3 trans people. And still, a pay gap of 18% between men and women that would take 60 years to eradicate on current trends. So there clearly are enormous inequalities there, which have been clearly heightened during the COVID-19 period. And as I said, that is included regionally. So during the crisis, I think it's notable that people living across the north experienced a bigger fall in their mental well-being than people in the rest of the country. They're more likely to become unemployed or to have their working hours reduced. Pretty horribly, also, they were more likely to actually die of COVID-19 as well. And we see those kinds of inequalities also affecting women, more likely to be furloughed, more likely to be denied it as well if they requested it. Disabled people 11 times more likely to die of COVID. And of course, hit by the lack of uprating of legacy benefits for people who required those, and the extent of impact of the crisis on Black, Asian and ethnic minority people. I think many people in this room will be aware of, but Baroness Doreen Lawrence has set that out very powerfully in her report, An Avoidable Crisis, which I would really recommend to people if they haven't been able to look at it yet. And I think there is a very big question about people's attitudes around these kinds of inequalities. I thought Bobby's analysis was fascinating there. And I perhaps am more optimistic around some elements of this agenda, perhaps. I think the point that he raised around changes in attitude towards social security is a very important one, actually. That felt like a quite significant hardening. If you look at British social attitudes surveys, year upon year, it looked like we were getting a hardening of attitudes that was really quite stubborn. That has started to change. I think it's quite notable. In addition, interestingly, people's views have changed substantially about what they want government to do after a crisis. So after the global financial crisis, there was much more support, not something that I was delighted about at the time, quite the opposite, but anyway, much more support for cuts in government spending than for changes in taxation. That has reversed pretty much since then. So now you have quite a bit more support for changes in taxation and very low support for changes to spending. Now, perhaps that's not a surprise because we've had 10 years of austerity and people have seen the impact of those cuts, but I think it does show a different point of view from people about perhaps the promise of government action than maybe there would have been before. When it comes to regional inequality, I mean, I agree with Bobby. I think, again, there are changing views around this. I don't think it's because of the Conservative government constantly talking about levelling up, because we know that even just that phrase isn't resonating with people. People don't understand what it means. But they certainly saw what happened when Andy Burnham went to try and demand more resources and didn't get them, and then suddenly they were unlocked for everybody else across the country. They certainly saw that, and they certainly noticed that, not just people in the north, but people right across the country. That, I think, has had an impact. And I think we've also had certain instances where people have noticed the extent of division and prejudice. I mean, I know it's continually mentioned, but I do think it was quite significant that government ministers found themselves forced to climb down after refusing to condemn those who had been abusive towards the England men's football team. You know, there is that kind of different notion of Englishness that seems to have quite strong popular backing, and I think quite a lot of attitudes analysis backs that up, actually, and suggests that there is a different vision of Englishness now that is developing. You know, how can we start to deal with all of this? Well, so much that needs to be done. I think, again, when we look at opinion polling, overwhelmingly people say they want to have more power closer to them. Now, of course, that can mean a whole variety of different things. I'm not naive about that. And actually, when you talk about whether people want new institutions, additional politicians, yes, they don't. Okay, so that's a pretty strong message that we get. But they do want to ensure that there is more local control, particularly around economic development, around transport, around housing, around local services, but in a way that doesn't create unfair postcode lotteries. So Labour has set up a commission on the UK's future under Gordon Brown, just looking at many of these questions and how we can ensure that greater control. And then I think we also can ensure that we have an approach to those other inequalities, which will bite, but also which will have public support. You know, there is often support for transparency, for example, and yet we still don't see it around ethnicity pay gap reporting, something that even the Conservative government is committed to, that hasn't put into place. We also don't see any opposition pretty much to improving the criminal justice system for women and girls, particularly after the situations that we've seen recently. And just finally, I would say that there's quite strong public support for the kinds of measures that Labour has been setting out around the labour market. And I just want to end on that, because actually the driver of so much inequality in the UK, it's not just about redistribution, of course. It really is about how the labour market works. Over time, we've seen a reduction in the share of national income going to labour, an increase in the amount going to assets proportionally compared to that going to labour. And this is not inevitable. We can do things to change it. I think the fair pay agreements announced a couple of days ago by Angela Rayner will make an enormous difference there. Having that focus on pushing up pay, you know, particularly in the worst paid areas of the economy, I think that could make a radical difference, and in fact we know from the comparative evidence that it will. So now that I've said that, nobody can question me about any of it. Sorry, I'm going to have to run out of the room, but thank you ever so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anneliese. Sonia.
Great, thanks, Bobby. So I guess what I want to think about is, I thought that was a really fascinating presentation and really interesting polling, and lots of really important insights, some of which aren't that surprising, I think, to those of us who sort of kind of know a bit about polling and the way that the public thinks about things. So I guess I want to take it as my starting point and think about if your starting point, like mine is that there's too much inequality around and you really want to reduce it, how do you effectively make the case for that given where the public is? And so I've become increasingly interested in the last 2 or 3 years in the research around how you talk to people about things that you want to do and how you best make the case for it. And I think there are sort of particular implications around both like economic inequalities and race inequalities. So I'm just going to say something about kind of 2 or 3 pieces of research. Apologies, I can see some people in the room who are at an event that I spoke at yesterday, so you're going to hear it all again. Slightly different bits of research, but still. So I want to say something about 2 or 3 bits of research that I sort of engaged with over the last 2 or 3 years on that and what I think it means. So the first is, so I'm on the board of a philanthropic foundation called the Trust for London, and our mission is to reduce poverty and inequality in London. And we fund a lot of, a bit unusually for a philanthropic foundation, we do fund a lot of work on campaigning, because we think the policy and the political context is really important. But a lot of the work has been around sort of, I suppose, the low income end of the spectrum, in terms of, so, we've been involved with work around a minimum income standard, for example. And so one of the things we wanted to do was fund some work around wealth, to understand public attitudes to wealth, because we just thought, actually, so much of what gets talked about is wealth taxation in this debate. So it's really important to understand in the same way. So the minimum income standard is something that was developed by Loughborough University, and it's one of the reasons it's behind the whole concept of a living wage. And one of the reasons why I think it's so interesting is it's about a public consensual approach to what is the minimum standard of living that a family should have in the UK. And it's stuff like, you should be able to have like one holiday a year in the UK. And if you've got children, it's just not wrong. It's wrong if you don't have that. Like, that's something, so it's part of a basic standard that people should have. So it's very interesting. It's all about this consensual approach. So we funded a piece of research by the same people to look at wealth. And we were interested in understanding, there's quite a lot of scepticism in some ways, but just understanding, is there a similar level, can you get to a similar level of consensus among the public about a level of wealth that is just too high, like, i.e. you just don't need it anymore, it's quite unnecessary. And we just thought that was an interesting question to ask, and the answer, maybe unsurprisingly, is no. There's no level of you can't get to a level of consensus through multiple kind of groups with members of the public on this, in the same way that you can a minimum income standard of living. But there were some really, really important things to come out of that research, because it's, and every bit of research I'm going to talk about is sort of qual research, which I think is a really important complement to all the sort of high-level polling, which tells you where people stand. And I think the qual research can tell you why people have those attitudes. And so on the wealth stuff, it was really interesting. And it's just like, people are just not where the left wants them to be on wealth. They think that unless there's a really good reason to think that somebody has got undeserved wealth, wealth is deserved. If you're really, really rich, if you're like Richard Branson or like J.K. Rowling, good for you. Like, I would love that to happen to me, is basically the attitude that people have. And there's nothing immoral about it. And there's quite a high level of belief in meritocracy and desert. And that is something very powerful, I think, culturally in Britain, that the left has to engage with. Most people think that our society is more meritocratic than it actually is. And that's a very powerful kind of instinct that people have about fairness and the world, and it's something you have to engage with. So I think that's really interesting, because I think it, in terms of framing stuff and the way you talk about closing the gap and closing inequality, I think some of the language that Labour has used in the last few years, like slogans like the many versus the few, is not particularly effective, because people they either think they're the few or they want to be in the few in relation to that slogan. And so it's a bit like, so it's a difficult setup. And that stuff, I think, is echoed. So the research around structural economic reform and how, like, qualitative research about how you make the case for structural economic reform, I think really shores a lot of that stuff up. Again, it shows meritocracy is a really powerful lens through which people see the world. People are tend to be quite fatalistic, actually. So, you sort of might see the world and you might think outcomes aren't that great and are a bit unfair, but you're like, what other ways are there of doing things? And I've been particularly involved in some research on housing over the last few months, because I've been working with a housing charity, basically to try and understand how you would make the case for massive public investment in housing again. So loads more social homes on a really big scale. And that's been quite interesting to me. And all of the stuff that we know kind of generally about how people feel about the economy and desert and meritocracy, it all gets reflected in research about housing as well, which is, again, quite unsurprising. But, people think if you've got a really big, like basically a house that is worth a lot of money, that's because of the good decisions you've taken in your life, not because you're lucky. Now, we know as policy people, it is overwhelmingly to do with luck and being bought at the right time and like buying a house at the right time. But that is not how people see it. And that's kind of like, to be honest, that, you know, people don't sit down and deconstruct the world and think, you know, how much of this is to do with making the right decision at the right time and how much of it is actually just to do with prices going up in the housing market and, you know, I didn't really do anything to deserve that and it's untaxed, etc. So I think that is really important. The other thing, so you can't start an argument for big reform in the housing system with, you know, we've got all these people sitting in these massive houses and it's really unfair. Like, it just turns people off. That's like the wrong way in, I suppose. So I think that's sort of an important implication. Something else that really surprised me about the research that I wasn't expecting to see, but maybe Bobby and Paula, you work a lot more with public attitudes, so it might not be too surprising to you, is people just really don't like the political. So we tested different ways of making the argument for a big programme of investment in a new generation of, you know, decent homes at fair rent. And when we tested different ways of making the argument. I didn't think that the stuff around like fat cat developers and making an enemy out of them, I was sceptical about whether that would work, and it didn't work. But what also didn't work, which surprised me a little bit, was being even vaguely political about it. So it wasn't even like the Tory government have got this wrong and it's terrible. It was literally an argument on the level of successive governments have over decades neglected housing and now we need action. People didn't like that. They felt it was unfair blame. And they were much more positive about frames that were like, we've got this big societal problem. It's not like how it used to be, and it's much harder to do today what you could have done 30 years ago. And there is something that government could do, and we want government to do it. And they much, much preferred that in general. Obviously, it's a bit of a generalisation, but so I thought that was quite interesting because it's not even like bashing one party. It's literally just saying governments have got it wrong. People are like, that's not very fair, is it? So I thought that was quite interesting. And then the last sort of little bit of research that I want to talk about is research on attitudes to race. And there's a really good piece of research that I've drawn quite a lot on the columns that I write, which is depth, qualitative research. So it was based on, I think it was about 40 interviews with members of the public, 2 hours of interviewing per person. So really, really trying to explore and get to an understanding of why people think the way that they do about race. It was done by the Runnymede Trust and Voices for Change, and I'd really recommend having a look at it. And I think, again, it's like a really good complement to the polling. Because it helps explain why people see the world as they do. And the really big takeaway from that piece of research for me, and I've written about this, is people don't fall on they don't have one worldview that they stick to, and you're in that worldview, and that colours the way that you see race and the world, or the economy in the world. People hold quite conflicting worldviews actually at the same time, and a lot of people will hold perspectives and have certain attitudes that are really helpful to anti-racism campaigners. So luckily we live in a world where people just think outright racism is wrong. And actually, what came through in this research is a lot of people in the research kind of when sort of they were told about how black men do in the labour market, for example, a lot of people thought that that there was discrimination was a part of that. That's really helpful, actually. But people also have some quite unhelpful attitudes for anti-racism campaigners, and this will be in the same person. So people will think, things are getting better, and actually, to be honest, we've basically cracked it, but it's going to get better, and we don't even need to do anything because it's just getting better. People also think that racism is just... so this is another strand of public thinking that came out from this research. Racism is just kind of natural, it's always going to be there, and so you have to live with it a little bit. And these things conflict, right? So I think what the Conservatives are very effective at doing, actually, on the race stuff and in respect of the culture wars is... and I hate this debate about how they're talking to racists. I think what they're really good at doing is triggering the negative stuff in people and triggering people's fears. And I think what the left has to do is actually, it's like you're talking to the same people, and some of those people have like also really useful attitudes about race and inequality, and so you need to be able to speak to that side. And I think the left is actually sometimes really bad at understanding that, and sometimes it responds to the frames that the right use, and then it makes it even worse, because you're just reinforcing even more the debate that focuses on the problematic ways in which some people think about race, but then the same people will think about race in less problematic ways. So I think there's something really important about understanding that complexity of the way that the public think about things, and in fact, the way that you or I think about things, because we all have, we're all human, we're all irrational, we all have these sort of quite conflicting worldviews at the same time, and we can think more than one thing at once. And I think that's really important for campaigners on the left. So those are just three bits of research, and I think there's so much I think we're living in quite exciting times in terms of mapping where the public are on this stuff and how the public think, and I think the left has to get a lot better at kind of understanding that stuff. And I there are very good examples of where campaigners for progressive change, like in terms of equal marriage, like in terms of abortion reform in Ireland, have really taken the time to understand how to frame the case in a way that will change minds, as opposed to lecturing people about why they're bigots and they're wrong and why you're right. And for me, that is not the road to social change. But unfortunately, I think that we now live in a world where there is this big divide in the left about the right way to conduct these debates. And it feels to me like the side of the left that's like, we are so morally right and pure, and everyone else is just like wrong and you're bigots, and we're going to shout at you until you think about the world exactly in the same way that we do. Unfortunately, I feel like that is getting traction at the moment, which is a shame, because I don't think it's how the left can win.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sonia. Really great bits of research, yeah. Excellent. Paula.
Thank you. So I thought I'd make 4 points, 2 that come directly from Bobby's data, and 2 that start to think about how this might play out in a post-pandemic, assuming there is a post-pandemic world. So first of all, and Sonia's also picked up on this, I think what the first slide in particular showed is the real importance of framing around these issues. So if you take those lines as Bobby described them, huge recognition of income inequality. So there's you don't have to convince people that income inequality exists. That's not something that you need to do. People already believe that. There's also, on that slide, majority support for government intervention. So you don't even need to convince people very hard that it's something that government should be doing something about. But when you get to that question that talks about it as redistribution, and specifically, I think, in that wording, to the less well-off, that's when support starts to drop. And I think that's partly because that framing, not so much the redistribution, but the framing around the less well-off, allows people to project onto that person I don't like, neighbour I don't like, whoever. And that allows people then to feel, well, I don't want that person or that type of person to be benefiting. So that's something around the framing. But I think it's also, before that becomes a very depressing conversation, I think it's also worth noting that even when we have that question, we're still looking at support at around 40%. And I think most people in this room are very happy if a party could win 40% of the vote at the next election. So it's not a hopeless case. The second thing I wanted to draw out, and again, Sonia's already pointed to this, is this deep-seated belief in meritocracy and the way that this brings up real contradictions for people. I think it brings up real contradictions, particularly for people on the left. So you end up with this very odd set of beliefs where particularly graduates tend to have structuralist belief about inequalities, but they don't have structuralist beliefs about their own position in society. So they got there through hard work, but other people are there because of the social structures. And I think that's really difficult to unpack. It's very difficult for us as individuals to accept that maybe we're just where we are because we were lucky. Okay, that's very hard to accept as an individual. So that's another framing that really needs unpacking. But the converse of that also is that that same meritocracy discourse also allows other people to individualise and blame themselves if they don't rise up. So I think it's a really difficult and damaging discourse, and I don't know how we get out of that loop, but I think that came out of the data. The third thing, moving us on a bit more directly to thinking about the pandemic, and if you can indulge me an academic argument just for a couple of minutes, I'll try not to do it for very long. If we go back to the 1970s and we pick up Ron Inglehart's work on the move to post-materialist values. So he argued that when people's immediate needs are met and they feel secure in the world, they can focus on self-realisation, what he called post-materialist values, non-economic issues. Now, we've seen that. I diverge from Inglehart in that he sees this as a single move from materialist to post-materialist, and I think both become important. But what we don't yet know, I don't think, is how people are going to respond to the immense insecurity everybody has felt for the last 18 months. If anything is going to cause a radical realignment of our values, a radical change in our values, something like the experiences we've had over the last 18 months could do that. And I don't think any of us are in a position to predict how that might work out. What's going to be greater when we do get to a post-pandemic world, the desire to have our old lives back or the desire for change? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows yet. And I think that's something that if the left are serious about wanting to use that moment to bring about change, then they need to find a way of working with people's desperate desire to have their old lives back as well. So they need to know how to move between those two. I think the pandemic has also perhaps changed what people see as possible. So people saw in May last year, I'm lost with years, I don't even know what year it is anymore. I think it's just been a big blur since 2019. But people saw if you threw enough money at a problem, you could solve it. So take homelessness. We took people off the streets in May 2020, is that the right year? Yeah. So I think when we come out of this, people will have a change. You won't be able to say this problem is too difficult to solve because you've solved it by throwing enough money at it. So I think people's idea of the possible might change. And my final point was to move all this onto levelling up. There's a lot of disagreement amongst pollsters and people doing focus groups about the extent to which people recognise the term levelling up. So I don't know who's right because I haven't sat in on their focus groups. Some people claim that they get immediate recognition for it in focus groups. The polling is much less clear cut. I think it's hard to measure very carefully because the brilliance of levelling up as a political slogan is that it's a familiar term. Okay, if you know immediately, roughly, what levelling up means, you know roughly it's a good thing, it's simple, everyday language, people can have a guess at what it means and they can project onto it what they want it to mean. And in that way, it works wonderfully as a campaign slogan. So what can Labour do about that? How can they counter that slogan? I think, firstly, levelling up is still deliberately vague. I don't know if it's deliberately vague or if they're just not capable of filling out what it's supposed to mean, but it's certainly still vague. Labour can be filling in what it should mean and therefore creating a set of measures, metrics by which it can be judged. So if you influence what people think levelling up is, then when it isn't delivered, you're there and able to say, actually, levelling up hasn't happened. If you let people just project onto it, then it's too easy for the government to say, well, yes, we've built a new football pitch quite close by. They can do those things. You need to be able to define what it means for people. And in that sense, I think also pick up on what both Bobby and Anneliese were saying about people being concerned about differences between areas, but that can be quite local. It's not necessarily differences between regions. And the second point, bringing all this together, is just that critical importance of framing. Sonia mentioned the sort of power of positive frames. The one thing Boris Johnson, well, I don't know, it might not be the only thing Boris Johnson is good at, but a thing that he's very, very good at is positive framing. Okay? He always comes out with positive, hope, optimism, and so on. Levelling up is an example of that, and that's where I think it appeals to people, because it's that positive framing. The left have a understandable habit of telling people how bad everything is, whereas the opposition are telling them how good things could be. And until you find a way to counter that, the kind of hope and optimism, I think, is more likely to win out.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paula, and thank you, Sonia and Anneliese, in absence. That was just brilliant. I've got lots and lots of thoughts myself on it, but I really do want to hear from people. We've got a microphone at the back there, so yes, please come. I saw your hand first. Please just say who you are and your question or comment.
I'm Liz Hind. I am from Labour Business. I'm also a researcher at York Law School. There's one group of people whose economic impact was most profound in that they got absolutely no support whatsoever. So, over 3 million people got no economic support whatsoever. And yet I have seen no analysis at all, not just in your report, which looks at access to furlough, but it doesn't look at who it was who was completely excluded from help. What was the gender makeup of those people? What was their ethnicity makeup? What was their disability makeup? There is no analysis that I've seen. And then that's, business support schemes. What was the gender impact analysis of the way in which we supported businesses? Were women's businesses supported in the same way that men's businesses were? I would say no, they weren't. So why haven't we seen that analysis? Because it's not just your report, it doesn't exist. So why doesn't it exist?
Great, thank you. And the support, that's for small businesses, that's what you mean?
So all of those business support
All the
schemes,
business
all of
support.
those billions of pounds that were given out, where did they go?
Great, well, let's take a couple. Yes, that fella.
Thanks. Hello, Aidan Heald from Salford Labour Party and NHS doctor. So I've seen quite a bit of COVID in the last 18 months. It's a question about demography and people's views. I do a lot of door knocking. I live in Salford and work in Salford. If I knock on a semi-detached house in a relatively affluent area of Salford, the likelihood is that, not certain, but on average, the people in that house will have values that are relatively resonant with people in this room. If I knock on the same door in Macclesfield or in Nantwich in Cheshire, same sort of demographic situation, same kind of jobs, the answer may well be very different. In other words, there's a significant chance that the people in the house will not be resonating with the kind of views that you've so eloquently described in terms of social housing, in terms of wealth, in terms of race. So my question is the kind of friends and neighbours thing. Why is it that just moving literally 40 miles, same house, same kind of demographic situation, that the geography seems to change so much? Because you're moving from essentially a Labour-controlled area to a Tory-controlled area. Something we've thought about a lot over the years, and just wondered if you had any answers.
Great question as well. Is there one more? Yeah, Tim. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Tim Bale from Queen Mary University of London. It's for Bobby, actually. Could you go into a little bit more detail about why you think there are differences between the three lines that you showed right at the beginning? Is it the R word? But even then, there's still a difference between the line at the top and the line in the middle. So if you could just unpack that a little bit, I'd be really interested.
Great, thank you, Tim. So that's probably enough for now. Sonia, do you want to take any of those, any or all?
Yeah. So. Well, I guess there was a really good question about, and I think I'll take it quite broadly in terms of gender impacts of the pandemic. And I think this probably relates to what Paula was saying in terms of understanding the impact it has both on people's material reality, but also the way we think about the world, which I thought was really interesting. But I think there has been some research more broadly, in terms of maybe not in business, but more broadly there has been. And it's worrying in terms of who is picking up the slack, etc., in the pandemic. So I think that probably does have an impact on the way that people think about the world. It certainly had an impact for me personally in the way I think about the world. Like, you know, I can feel my own sort of political opinions and stuff shifting as the pandemic went on, in, you know, in sometimes quite interesting ways. So I think, so just to sort of try and tie the question, so about what happened and impact on inequality and how people sort of feel about the world. So I think, for example, on gender, there will be really interesting implications, but like Paula, I think we don't sort of really understand them yet. And then I thought the question about that, like when you're door knocking in very similar houses, is such a good way of framing that question. It's really good, not least because my sister lives in Nantwich, so I know it quite well. And I guess it speaks to you know, the big differences in tribes in different parts of the country that are very easy to stereotype and be like, you know, metropolitan liberal elite in the cities and people outside the cities don't think like that. And but that is clearly and I think what will be behind some of those differences in values according to geography will be the stuff that we know that sits behind that, like age and education levels, which are the sort of, you know, new sort of dividing lines in politics. And I think that does raise challenges for political parties, particularly for Labour. And actually, the event that was a bit similar to this that I spoke at yesterday, it was actually about a different set of polling that the SMF have released around. So they basically did a piece of research that divides voters into sort of 9 sort of tribes that are based on an attitudinal analysis. And what was really interesting that came out of that was that Labour's voters are sort of distributed across the 9 different attitudinal clusters, whereas Tory voters are really concentrated in 2, which I think really nicely illustrates, you know, the stuff that we know, because things like Brexit have illustrated it to us quite vividly, which is Labour's got to be able to speak to a more diverse set of people in terms of the attitudes they have and the way that they think about the world than the Conservatives do. And the Conservatives, I think, are really using the fact that they're fishing in a sort of less attitudinally diverse pond to their advantage in some ways. And it is more difficult for the left because the left has to win the people who live in, you know, the semi-detached house in Nantwich and in Salford. So yeah, that's not. I don't have any particular wisdom to impart, but I do think that's a really powerful way of illustrating it.
Great, thank you, Sonia. Paula.
I don't have any expertise on the question that you're asking, but I did hear Anneliese quote some figures on gender and furlough and women being refused furlough. Okay, it's not my area.
We've got millions of people who are essentially powerless, whose problems aren't being talked about, I suspect because they don't fit into the narrative of the left and who the left is talking about in terms
That's
of
a good point,
inequality.
yeah.
It doesn't fit, but there are millions of people that went with no support whatsoever, and we are still voiceless because, you know, your reports on inequalities do not cover our inequality. So, you know, and the data doesn't exist. So, you know, I'm looking for a research project at the moment. Let's generate that data because we need it.
Very good. Yeah.
I think the data might exist in some of the COVID responses on something like Understanding Society, because it asks about individual household finances in a way that might allow you to create it.
It doesn't. The ONS will tell you that it doesn't
exist. That's crazy.
Because you can't generate accurate reports on self-employment income. We're always chasing behind, and the ONS will state that.
But this is survey data that asks about household income, so there would be a way of constructing a measure. It might not be a perfect measure, but at least it would allow you to get at it. But I was just pointing to what Anneliese had said. It's not my field of research. I wanted to pick up the point about kind of demography and geography, and I'm always a little bit sceptical that geography has some kind of real effect on people, because ultimately it's all made up by people. And I know of research in the US in particular that looks at self-selection into areas. So actually there might be a certain amount of it explained by the areas people choose to live in being driven by their values in the first place. I don't think it's something we have great data to look at. I think I've long wanted to do a research project which looks at the relative impacts of, for example, an individual's own education level and the education levels of those around them and how those two things interact. I just need a few more days in the week to get around to that particular project.
Yeah, great, thank you. Just a very quick point on that is that is fascinating, and the extent, the interaction between geographical sorting based on values and the extent to which people grow into the values because they're in contact with people around them who have similar values, and how the kind of socialization aspects of those types of things is really, really interesting. I think, like, fundamentally for me, what it points to, because you can't predict that easily on demography alone, is the importance of these underlying values or worldviews. And I think we're only just starting to really try to unpick that more in the current context. And that's notwithstanding Sonia's brilliant point about full of contradictions. These worldviews are not set, they're very context specific, and it doesn't absolutely predict how you're going to react to different things, because naturally we are irrational in lots of different ways. So it's not absolutely determinate, but it's still a really important thing to understand, and its interaction with geography. I mean, I do think there is something interesting from the pandemic about whether there is going to be a different geographical dispersion post pandemic, because we've just had such a concentration of young people in urban areas, and it's been one of the maybe not noticed enough trends in the UK and the US, very similar pattern. They call it a very dangerous experiment, that we've never lived quite so age segregated in the US or the UK, and that is a worry, which actually relates to our next session on culture wars straight after this. But just to pick up finally on Tim's really good question, I mean, I think we noticed these two questions. European Social Survey happens to ask a different sort of version of this question from British Social Attitudes Survey, and people just kind of presenting it, and it does go back to Paula's point about the importance of framing and how people react to this. And I think there is something special in the R word, the redistribution word, and particularly because when you look at who moves most between those two different types of questions, it's very clearly Conservative supporters. So you talk to Conservative supporters with anything with redistribution, no interest in that. You talk to them about the government should take measures or do something generally about it, much more openness to that. And I think the underlying point of our work, I think, on this and the culture wars, the segmentations that we're doing, is you need to head for a little bit of the middle ground within this. You're wanting to convince those softer people in the middle. There's always a big middle group that controls this, whether you've got a majority or not. And the reason you want to look at what are the cues in what convinces or doesn't convince those people who are connected to that more individualistic or more traditionalist in cultural terms segment, is because you want to pull some of them in through talking to them in the right way, not starting the conversation in completely the wrong place. And I think that is the kind of clue and cue that comes from this research about how do you frame it, and Sonia described it so well, as did Paula. Great, I'm afraid that is all our time, 10:30. Thank you so much, brilliant questions, brilliant points, and just for me to thank the team for putting this together and our brilliant panel. Thank you.
Thanks.